Is this working? Yeah. Okay, we are going to start. Good evening. This evening we have the last lecture of this series on mediation that we've been hosting at the Institute during this term. And we have the pleasure to introduce Jean-Louis Cohen, who is, as many of these other colleagues that have been part of the series, a rather polyphacetic character. He has been, like many of them, like most of them, trained as an architect, but also has been trained or has completed a PhD degree, which is actually one of the things that distinguishes him from other guests during this term. He has a PhD in history, and he has developed a very extensive work as an academic, as first director of the architecture research of the first as a professor of the schools of architecture of Paris, Villemin, and the University of Paris, and he has been also teaching, being a professor of architectural history in New York University of Fine Arts. He has been also a director of architecture research of the research program of the French Ministry of Housing, and amongst other things, he has been a director of the Institut Francais d'Architecture until 2003. He is, I understand, currently the director of the Musée des Monuments Français, and he has his kind of main project, which I understand is still incomplete, is as creator of the Cité de l'Architecture at the Palais Chaillot, which I understand is still something in development, and as part of that, he's developing the Musée des Monuments Français as one of the institutions that would be hosted in that big project. Jean-Louis Cohen has been also a prolific author of history books, which probably many of you know. Many of them related to the work of Le Corbusier, and basically he has work on modernism in general. And finally, he has been curating a variety of different shows, and I think that the lecture tonight is going to be mainly about this work as a curator, which I think will add one different side to this role of mediators that we've been discussing here. Welcome tonight, Jean-Louis. Hopefully we'll have time later on to discuss with you after your presentation.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I'm deeply grateful to you and the Berlage and all the friends at the Berlage and in Rotterdam for this generous invitation to give the last word chronologically, but perhaps not the last word in terms of discussing the issues to this very wonderful series. I think that you've managed with this series of speakers really to sometimes with unexpected neighbors, really to develop the discourse on issues that are very important to architecture today. Architecture is a social product, a social practice, and as we know, architects need partners to be able build their designs and to go from the drawing board to the building site. I can't understand all the questions that were asked at the beginning of this series. I remind everybody what the questions were, because maybe they've been lost in translation. What is the relevance of architecture for the public? Of course, architecture is extremely relevant for the public and for the citizens, and here the citizens and the public are not always, do not always coincide. What is the most relevant approaches in practice today? Where and why? So this would require a year-long seminar and well beyond our forces, and I won't be able to answer this. What is your forecast for the future? Another wide-ranging question. I think that today's future is extremely difficult to forecast for all sorts of reasons. We can have a view of what will happen in the next 5 years if we look at big building sites, because decisions have been made. If we look at the Biennale at Las Palmas and at the rising tides, we are in front of an ocean of uncertainties. So we'll not answer this question. I will try to focus on the last question. What are the mechanisms in which architectural concepts become successfully implemented? And I will deal here not with the internal mechanisms of architecture, not with the professional issues, but much more with the cultural issues, with the fact that in order to implement architecture, the architects' partners and the citizens need to understand what architecture is about. And as we know, and here I'm repeating points I was discussing with students before, it is clear that the general audience has a very loose view of architecture, whereas most readers of daily newspapers understand something about theater, the movies, and literature because they read weekly or daily chronicles. It is very exceptional to find someone like Luis Fernandez Galliano, for instance, or Nikolai Rusov at the New York Times, or what Friedrich Achleitner used to do in Vienna, or Bruno Zevi in L'Espresso, to find voices, mediating voices that were able to introduce audiences, the public, to issues internal to such a sophisticated discipline as architecture is. And here I want to start coming to my topic. I want today to focus on one particular mediation of architecture, the mediation of exposition. I'm not only talking about the exposition, but about the exhibition, but about exposition and exhibition at large. Here we see Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson at the time of the Mies exhibition at MoMA right after World War II, an exhibition that was absolutely fundamental in taking Mies out of Chicago onto the broad scene of North America. This exhibition would really raise the view that had been given before the war by MoMA of Bauhaus and Gropius being at the center of the new culture and propel Mies to an extremely different career. Exposing architecture can be a very simple ambition if we stick to the words, but we can understand this concept of exposition in many ways. Is it exposing architecture to public glance as newborns were exposed at the hospital's doors to be taken and adopted by strangers, or does exposing architecture means what I could call raising the veil on architecture's mysteries, presenting architecture in all its dimensions, presenting all its hidden mechanisms, from the most objective ones dealing with technology to the most difficult and sophisticated one, means bringing light, shedding light to the documents, to the traces, to the memorabilia of the design process as much as on buildings. And here I want to build a little bit upon the experience I've had from 1998 to 2003, dealing with a building that's located on the side of this view. What we see here is the Paris Exposition of 1937. On the foreground, the infamous confrontation between the Soviet Pavilion and the Nazi Pavilion. The building in the back, the Palais Chaillot, was a building which had been, and I will return to it, had been devoted to a very original way of showing architecture. It had been the siege since 1880, roughly 1882, of a unique museum of plaster casts of buildings, showing full-size elements of building that were in the late 80s sleeping under these tops, sort of phantasmatic view of architecture under a 19th century iron and glass roof. So I was called in 98 by a left-wing minister of the Jospin government to bring, in a way, to bring some light into the grave of this museum and to shape a new institution in this particular place. And then I was in 2003 purged by a right-wing minister who felt that museums had to be run by administrators and not by architects, even museums of architecture, and that I had to give way to a different kind of people. Having to expose, and here I return to my theme, having to expose, and I have a problem, I maybe have a problem with the settings of the computer. Let me check. Let me check for a second. I might have a problem of, yeah. Okay. Hope it. Good. So let me return to the question of exposition. It is a paradox that we should have to wonder how to expose what is perhaps the most public and the most widely exposed form of art. Here, of course, an obvious example of this wide exposition to everyone glance. Architecture is paradoxically the most exposed art, as it shapes the frame of human life, and at the same time, this presence is so bright that it becomes literally blinding about its mechanism and its concepts. And here the notion of blinding can be taken in the literal way, because as you know, I'm referring here to Frank Gehry's other major building, the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. The entire surface of the building is being currently reshaped, smoothened in order not to bounce back an exceeding amount of light to the nearby residents. The building became blinding. Architecture, and here I will stick to the photographic metaphor, architecture that can be super exposed in its evidence can also become practically invisible in its finest grain. Such an invisibility sticks to practical and multiple reasons. Some of these reasons are aesthetics reasons. Other reasons are historical. The peculiarity of the codes of form according to which buildings are ordered are particularly opaque to the lay public. And for instance, it is clear that many high-rise, large-size urban developments have been discredited because of their social meaning, whereas their architectural qualities were extremely significant and acknowledged by the profession. Another aspect, and here I will make a French example, the assimilation of certain buildings to oppression or to exclusion, and even sometimes to extermination, doesn't allow the audience to understand the character of innovation they had initially. This is, for instance, the case of a well-known scheme by Eugène Baudouin, Marcel Lotz, and Jean Prouvé, the La Muette development in Drancy, north of Paris, the first high-rise schemes with steel facade, with steel skeleton in French practice, 15-story high. This part of a building was transformed by the Nazis into a concentration camp where dozens of thousands of Jews were processed, if I may say so, on the way to extermination. So it's clear that this major innovative development, which was decades ahead of its time, was completely discredited by this adjacency, by this collusion between history at large and architectural history. And in the end, the most daring part here, the metallic part, was torn down in 1977, whereas the U-shaped part, which was much more traditional, was kept as a memorial and also is still used as housing. So it's interesting to see here that the innovation was suppressed, the trace of innovation was suppressed for the sake of preserving a certain memory, a very complex history I don't pretend to bridge in 2 minutes. By exploiting further the photographic metaphor, I would say that architecture requires to be focused, to be understood in its components and its materiality. Many strategies, multiple strategies have been developed in the past 2 or 3 centuries to reveal, to print, and to transmit its image. And here I will discuss briefly episodes in the shaping of architectural exhibitions and museums. The documents that were either to reserve to internal communication within workshops and studios and to dialogue with clients were offered to audiences when architectural drawings entered collections in the salons of the 17th and 18th century. At that time, aristocrats who had started collecting, and architects like Inigo Jones, who had started collecting drawings by Palladio and other Renaissance architects, were beginning to show them, and specific buildings were already designed to exhibit these collections. This is one of the earliest, by John Talman in London, one of the earliest buildings specifically designed for the exhibition and the preservation of architectural drawings. Buildings were already beginning objects of collections. So drawings were becoming objects of collections, and models were also becoming extraordinary pieces in some private collections. Here I'm thinking of the extraordinary Musée des Plans Reliefs in Paris, and I forgot to bring a slide. This museum created by the French military in the 17th century with huge models of entire cities. And if you've liked the collection of models collected at Las Palmas, go to the Invalides, and you will see what these models tell you about the relationship to water and to landscape at large. Collections were also built as far as St. Petersburg, where the Academy of Fine Arts has a wonderful collection of such models. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, some policies and experiments lead to the invention of the Museum of Architecture. They are very often, it is interesting to note that they are very often engineered by painters. So this one is an example. The gallery opened by the painter Cassa in 1808, Rue de Seine, near what could become the École des Beaux-Arts in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a gallery of stucco, of plaster and cork models. Cassa had been to Asia Minor. He had been to Egypt, as you see here, and to Syria and Lebanon. Hence, this collection was much broader than the previous collections to be found in European cities. Here we see some examples of the surviving models of the museum by Cassa. Architects such as John Soane, whose collection of ornaments, models, and drawings would be open in 1826, would also contribute to this movement. One of the most extraordinary experiments is one that grounds it constitutes the first episode of the story leading to the musée at the Palais de Chaillot. The first Musée des Monuments Français, Museum of French Monuments, remains a milestone in the history of museums, not only because of its collections, their works that had been saved from the destruction of churches, monasteries, and castles destroyed and sold for limestone by the French Revolution. So it was a sort of salvaging attempt. At the same time, the Muséum des Monuments Français, it is rather ignored, was the first museum ever organized in a chronological sequence. It is obvious for us now when we see a museum that we start with the 12th century and Giotto and or before pre-Giotto and go to the 19th century. But the very unit of a century for measuring, this is the room of the 13th century, the museum as it was around 1810. But this notion of this way of dividing the historical narrative into discrete periods that had the century as module was invented by Lenoir, who was under heavy fire at that time from people within the academic establishment, the most violent of them being Quatremer de Quincy, the very authoritarian father of traditional architectural history, who pretended to be a museophobe by relating to this museum. At the same time, major historians such as Jules Michelet, one of the major historians in all of Europe in the 19th century, would be totally brought to history by this collection. So here we see an interesting example of composing a sort of architectural spectacle with fragments of buildings. The goal being, and it's very important, the goal being to bring forward these examples of high art and architecture and sculpture, not only to the general audience, but also to the artists and to the architects to stimulate their imagination. So the point I want to make here is that museums have been absolutely fundamental also in the training of the eye of architects. And this goes as far as people like Le Corbusier and others in his generation. Le Corbusier was a rather avid observer of the collections that had survived from this museum. Here we see the Museum of Architecture of the Technische Universität in Berlin. On the right, room where we find drawings by Schinkel. And the point I want to make, the following point I want to make is that from this moment onwards, there will be two ways for the development of the presentation of architecture in the context of galleries. One way will be the permanent collection, essentially historical, and the other way will be the exhibition, will be the temporary exhibition. The development of these policies will be very uneven. Collections of museums developed by, in a sort of erratic ways after the restoration, and it will remain very, very limited. Whereas the theater of technical invention and formal innovation will be found in the exhibitions. And here I'm not talking only about architectural about exhibitions of models or drawings. The great universal or national exhibitions of the 19th century encounter the new architecture of the industrial age on one side with the unifying shape of the great containers such as Paxton's Crystal Palace in 1851, but also these exhibitions are bearers of new architectural values through the shape of multiple pavilions that use exotic or regional styles in a sort of hysterical multiplicity. From this moment onwards, two lines of development within the exhibitions themselves are developing, and to a certain extent, the contemporary policies, the policies of mediations that we know here, develop from this duality. The first policy was meant to evoke the real scale of a building thanks to the restitution of its element at natural size. And here again, I return to the Chaillot Hill. This museum, created in 1882, was called the Museum of Compared Sculpture. It was, in fact, a museum of architecture. And it was created, this is here a point I also want to make, as a sort of projection into three-dimensional space of a particular book, Viollet-le-Duc's Dictionary of Medieval Architecture. So the issues that Viollet-le-Duc has discussed, the chapters, the examples, were cast on the surviving medieval buildings and put on the walls. And here, the point I want to make is that very often the museum or the exhibition is, first of all, a book, is a book put into space, that very often the book precedes the creation of didactical space such as here. So what you see is a very strange museum, a museum in which you have globally a chronological sequence, but you find Greek sculpture compared to medieval sculpture. The point Viollet-le-Duc wanted to make was that every age had an archaic moment, a classical moment, and a moment of decadence. So by comparing Greece and the Middle Ages, he aspired at being convincing. This museum is a very interesting one. It has to be noted, and here I have no slides to show you, that the birth of ethnographic museums, the birth of regionalism and nationalism in Scandinavia, in the Balkans, will lead to the creation of open-air museums that are often excised from the main narrative of architectural history because they're considered as nostalgic, regressive, if not totally reactionary folklore, but they belong and they also have shaped the culture of modernity. In the ordering of the big elements of architecture that we see here and the construction made in iron and glass, we had seen a black and white photograph of this gallery before. The Museum of Compared Sculpture at Chaillot is rather unique. It can be seen as a sort of illustration of Walter Benjamin's point when Benjamin reads the book published in 1928 by Siegfried Gideon entitled Bauen in Frankreich, Building in France, building in iron, building in concrete. When Benjamin reads the book, he, in a way, discusses an assumption of Gideon according to whom the architecture of the 19th century was shaped by the conflict between engineering and architecture. And he writes, Benjamin writes, that construction is, in the 19th century, plays the role of a bodily process around which, quote unquote, artistic architecture are superimposed just as dreams are superimposed around the framework of a physiological process. So in a way, he was saying that the language of historicism was the sort of onirical construction around the objectiveness of engineering. It is interesting that in this particular case, this process, a place devoted to the celebration of the great moments of French architecture, the Gothic, great times marked by the hegemony of structural thinking, the process described by Benjamin is inverted, and that in this instance, we have the illusion that the industrial roof evoking a market hall or a station is the dream that covers the dire reality of sculpted architecture. The other tradition at work in architectural exhibition, and here we see the galleries of the Architectural Society in London, is the presentation of, and is more conventional, is the presentation of documents relative to the buildings, whatever their nature can be, models used since classical antiquity, drawings, photographs, and all forms of stimulation of reality. All these representations narrate in a way a story parallel to the history of constructions. The first tradition I've mentioned led since the Industrial Revolution to the displacement of constructions, sometimes of experimental constructions, towards enclosed fields where temporary manifestations or open-air museums could be organized. This is the case with the Weissenhof-Siedlung exhibition in Stuttgart in 1927 and all its clones. This is, for instance, the plan of the exhibition that took place in Prague in 1932 at the Baba Siedlung. The second tradition has led to transformation of architectural culture that have sometimes had more effect than the buildings themselves. And here, of course, we have to remember the impact, at least in America, of the exhibition with which in 1932 the Museum of Modern Art will impose the slogan of the international style. But here what will carry the message will not be buildings, but photographs in black and white and models of Villa Savoye here, of Gropius's Bauhaus, of Mrs. Tugendhat Villa, and of a house designed by Aud for the Johnson family. So here we have a sort of formalist reduction of the more generous problematic of the Neues Bauen with its social accents presented in full scale in Stuttgart. I will also say that the 32 exhibition at MoMA was already mythical and is an extravagantly interesting example of mediation, was already a construction. And then its message has been again the object of mediated interpretation by MoMA itself and many people. So at some point it becomes very difficult to understand what the real impact of the exhibition has been, other than its celebration by its very authors themselves. I would introduce here differentiation, a legal differentiation practiced in France, and one that is very difficult to understand. Some architects like Pierre Gauthier, who have a good knowledge now of French public clients, might know it. This differentiation is based on identifying the master of the built work, who is the client, the master of the ouvrage, and the master of the œuvre, of the design. So let's say basically a differentiation between the one who handles the physicality of a building when it's built and the one who remains with the drawing and the photographs to be published in his or her complete works. I would say that the first tradition here deals with the ouvrage, with the building, and the second deals with the œuvre, with the intellectual documents. The first one, therefore, is perhaps a better instrument for dialogue with the public, especially when buildings are built, than the second one. Here again, we are dealing with models and drawing more with the second one. The boundaries between these genres are not always very tight, and here I want to mention an exhibition which is totally overlooked by history, but which was extremely important in continental Europe after 1945, an exhibition organized by Paul Nelson, an architect and painter who had worked with Fernand Léger and Perret, an exhibition organized in Paris Grand Palais called American Technology of Housing and Urbanism, 1939-1940X. This recalls a famous series of articles in the Architectural Forum pointing to a future of America, articles published in 1942. And what we see here is, on the right in particular, in a layout to which Louis Kahn participated, is the sort of vibrating relationship between drawings and models and buildings. This is the first stage in the Americanization of continental Europe, showing American models. And the poster by famous poster designer Paul Collin, I think is very telling. It seems to me to be a sort of illustration of what has been called, referring to Melanesia, the cargo cult, this local cult according to which villagers are expecting the arrival of a cargo, of a freighter ship, bringing goodies, downloading goodies from a crane. So this white house coming out on a ground which is strangely enough ordered according to the stripes of the American flags is, I think, a great view of the expectations that ruined Europe had of America at that time. And once again, this dealt with actual representations of buildings and representation of drawings. One understands here very, very clearly that architectural exhibitions have not only a one-sided contribution to the transformation of the discipline and of cities. Their function, the old function of emulation and distinction they had for the academies and the schools has lasted on the walls, on the pushpin walls of schools and in cultural manifestation. In opposition, however, to official ceremonies, exhibitions have always been a privileged medium for rebellion, for revolt against conservatives, from the exhibition of the Viennese secession to the exhibition of unbekannte Architekten, of unknown architects, through which the season of German expressionism opens after the defeat of 1918. Fighting factions of architecture in the Austro-German world have fully used this tool. Half a century later, provocative exhibitions have allowed artists of the independent group, here we see a famous collage by Richard Hamilton. It is through the medium of exhibitions and their provocations that the independent group has shaped positions that will, as you know, that will be the base for the subsequent development of both Team 10 and pop art. Here, we are back at MoMA, but with an extremely regressive, nostalgic, and perhaps even reactionary show, if there is such thing as a reactionary exhibition, maybe something we could discuss. This is 1976 and the exhibition celebrating 44 years after the international style, another international style, and perhaps a much more successful one, that is the eclecticism at the École des Beaux-Arts. Architectural exhibitions have also been, and I don't want to over-celebrate them, vectors of conservative and nostalgic campaigns. This particular one that attempted to close the cycle of modernity, or if we bring back to our memories these images of the 1980 Venice Biennale, the so-called Strada Nuovissima, engineered by Paolo Portoghesi. It is through an exhibition that the discourse of postmodernism struck public opinion. Exhibitions have also been, what I would say, tools or media of valuation, re-evaluation, devaluations, not always devaluation, but valuation, revaluation, or rediscovery of some architects and their problematics. Here we see a view of an exhibition organized in the 80s in the Accademia in Venice on the work of Carlo Scarpa by Boris Podreka and Mario Botta. The work of Scarpa, which was until that moment known only from a very small circle of conoscenti, reached a very different audience. Sometimes also exhibitions can have a very important impact in the, and here we are clearly in the center of the issue of mediation, in the reconciliation between populations and the architecture they live in. And here I have to make a small personal note. This is a view of the exhibition I organized in 2002 in Le Havre, a city bombed in 1944 and rebuilt by Auguste Perret as a completely gridded city of concrete buildings. The city was featured in all history textbooks, and the population hated the city unanimously because it was unable to understand it and viewed it as an example of built Stalinism, because the post-war mayors were communist, but they had no responsibility if this had been a state decision. So the effect of the exhibition by letting people understand that Perret had also built exquisite buildings like the Relevance chapel with stained glass, here with transparent concrete, that Perret was the friend of painters, of artists, had worked with sculptors, was in close contact with a series of post-impressionists, had himself designed exquisite pieces of furniture. This changed completely their view of Perret, and in a way, this re-evaluated not only the city, but their own life to their eyes. One very good evidence of this change mentality, and forgive me for being very trivial, but I think that we're dealing the very proof of your love for the architecture you inhabit is when you put money into its restoration, instead of thinking that you will move somewhere else. So real estate, managers of housing condominiums in the rebuilt city organized tours, took the owners of the apartments to the show. And after having seen the show, maybe 10,000 in a city of 200,000, maybe 30,000 visitors came to see the show. And after having seen the show, many of these owners decided to vote to accept the restoration works they were rejecting until that moment. So this is only a small example to see that when you really provide, thanks also to this particular medium of the exhibition, which is a medium, a warm medium, if I use McLuhan's thermometer. It is a medium where you can stop in front of a very well-crafted model, where you can discuss the variety of solutions that were, for instance, here developed for the belfry of the town hall. An exhibition is a way of producing knowledge and emotion at the same time, and therefore can have very useful effects, as in this very particular case. Monographic exhibition, we know, we all know the power of monographic exhibition in the exercise of narcissism in which architects indulge sometimes. So this is most exciting exhibition that had been made by Peter Eisenman at the Canadian Centre of Architecture, and for which Phyllis Lambert exceptionally had accepted to see part of her beloved walls being torn down and replaced by a rather extravagant design by Peter. So, but this is the effect of love. Here, of course, what the exhibition performed was a sort of revenge of Eisenman at a moment in which all of his architecture was paper. So being able to three-dimensionalize his architecture in a building was a way of going from the œuvre, the design, to the ouvrage, even if the ouvrage was very temporary. And of course, it's better in terms of insurance and leaks. Monographic exhibitions have also played an important role in the construction of knowledge. They have allowed to understand in a much more pungent way than books the design strategies of Le Corbusier. I will not show you any slides. Of Louis Kahn, of Carlos Carpa, of Alvar Aalto, of Mies van der Rohe, and many others. However, exhibiting architecture cannot be reduced to the celebration, even if very sophisticated and intellectually refined, of great figures. Exhibitions also play a significant role as a support of democratic practice. And here I enter a slightly different perspective on mediation. What we see here is one of the designs exhibited in 1910 in Berlin at the Great Town Planning Exhibition in Berlin. The project by Bruno Schmitz. Here we see the Reichstag and the idea of Schmitz of creating a big north-south axis, an idea that could be later the very base of the plan by Albert Speer. And on the right, we see the enlargement of a very small piece of paper. This is a page from the travel sketchbooks of Le Corbusier, Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, where he transcribed his impressions of the exhibition. So this exhibition was a key moment in the training of Jeanneret, but was also a major moment in the discussion of strategies for the Greater Berlin. Exhibitions are also moments of civic commotions. Could mention many other examples. The exhibition organized by Oskar Stolonov and Louis Kahn in Philadelphia in 1945 was a key turning point in the shaping of Philadelphia. On another ground, and here I'm showing an exhibition I had produced and conceived not in its build details, but in its intellectual structure for Paris Pavilion de l'Arsenal in 1988. It lasted for 15 years as the permanent narrative on the making of the city before being replaced by a rather interesting project today by Finn Geipel and Philippe Simon. Such projects are attempts at introducing mediation in areas where secrecy was the rule. So I, with a certain political reluctance, since I've always been an opponent to Chirac as a mayor, as a president, and later I think it's going to be the same, I participated to this project because it broke with the practice of complete secrecy about planning decisions. For the first time, Paris citizens were able to see all the competitors in an architectural contest, and not only the winner, or not only a blurred image of the winner before seeing the building. So it was extremely interesting to not only to exhibit recent projects, but also to contextualize them, to introduce them in an understanding of the permanent features and also the flexible features of Paris structure. Rather exceptional 30 years ago, until 1970, architectural exhibitions have become, in 3 decades, an extremely widely diffused cultural production. Their growth has been exponential. I have tried once to compute the number of architectural exhibitions produced every year. We are close to 1,500 worldwide, counting significant exhibition or less significant institutions. Just think of the enormous effort made in the Netherlands. So I don't think that there are any serious cultural evaluations, but it would be interesting to establish figures or computing systems that would allow us to compare the number of pages read by newspaper readers on architecture and the number of images seen in exhibition. But I'm convinced that the exposure to exhibitions, if I may say so, has been enormous. Catalogs have become extremely important media for the diffusion, but also for the establishment of historiographic decisions. And exhibitions have allowed the resurrection of forgotten episodes in the history of the 20th century. I had taken part, for instance, in the 1979 Paris-Moscow exhibition of the Centre Pompidou, when for the first time materials from the avant-garde were brought out from Moscow's bunkers. It was really a major episode, not only in Paris, but above all in Moscow, where the benediction the show had received from having been presented in Paris allowed all the semi-subversive historians to make their points in a better atmosphere. relatively exceptional initially, the engagement of historians and architects in exhibition has stopped to be a simple extension of their professional activity to become the very center of their activity. And here, I must say that there is now a real market for curators and designers of exhibition, a market on which university professors like myself, museum curators, and sometimes architects are in competitions. In fact, the resources, the specific resources of museums and departments created inside general museums, such as MoMA, for instance, since the 1980s, are not sufficient to support this mammoth program of production I have mentioned. And very complex networks have been established. Exhibitions contribute, and it is quite obvious to and I'm quite close to the end of this little causerie. Exhibitions contribute, I have only one page and one quarter of notes. Exhibitions contribute, and it is also a very obvious fact, to the promotion of historical work by revealing complex issues in works that had been caricatured. Here, an example of the same year, 79, the exhibition of commemorating the centennial of Viollet-le-Duc's death have shown to the audience that Viollet-le-Duc was not only the maker of fakes in the reconstruction or in the restoration of cathedrals, but a fundamental theoretician of structural thinking in architecture. Exhibitions also reveal tendencies, crises, and also preoccupations and anxieties, sometimes not without pervert effects. The part that biennales, triennales, and other periodical manifestations have taken in what could be called the rhythming of professional production seem to be sometimes leading to a specific architecture whose only purpose would be to be exposed in these manifestations, pretty much as movies that are made for festivals and not for general distribution. Anyway, even if this is sometimes a limit of some projects and a limit which is clearly understandable, legitimate, and even productive when we're dealing with the production of schools of architecture within these exhibitions, it is certainly a factor of innovation and confrontation of ideas. In contrast to monographic exhibitions or to thematic exhibitions and to programs dealing with current issues, museums of architecture have proliferated. It would be vain here to look for a single model in opposition to the art museum. There are canons for art museums, even if they are to some extent different in their shapes. But museums in Stockholm, such as the one you see here, in Helsinki, in Frankfurt, in Rotterdam, the one being currently made in Rome inside the museum designed by Zaha Hadid. All these museums are strikingly different, if not completely contradictory. The very ethos of the architectural museum is precisely to be able to propose a structure relating duration and change to allow for the comprehension of the divisions of historical time inside architecture in order to lead through the understanding of figures from the past to the active reception of movements within the present and the prospective developments of architecture. Here, of course, media have changed, and the media of the medium, that is, the architectural exhibition, have changed. And I don't want to be pedantic and boring in discussing this. We have bridged a gap that has led from the model. Here we see the very wonderful model, cross-sectional model of the Paris Opera House at the Orsay Museum, superimposed to walk-on model of the opera area. And here we see a 3D reconstruction, 3D walk-in reconstruction of Terragni's Danteum, done for an exhibition at MoCA several years ago. But this, as to paraphrase Victor Hugo, ceci n'a pas tué cela. The virtual reality hasn't killed the model. And one of the aspects I find the most fascinating about current exhibitions, sometimes, and about the Biennale at Las Palmas, is the effect models continue to have. I mean, why are models so powerful? Because they much more perhaps than 3D displays, they awaken, they bring back to life a little child we were in dealing with miniature objects, in having the in having a quasi experience of flying over the surface of the Earth. So I think that they keep their magics. In a period in which, in a time in which we will spend most of our professional life and most of our leisurely life in front of screens, I think that objects that are very small, very large, very dirty, very stinking, very etchy, very rough, are touching us much more than perfected objects that we see on these very screens. This is true, but it is also true that the question of the authenticity of objects in the age of in the age of the virtual is raised. That the meaning of a collection of drawings, of models, of original documents in the age of mechanical reproduction can be challenged. The question we have here is was perhaps best raised by Paul Valéry, a poet who was interested in architecture and who wrote in the 1920s in a very beautiful essay that museums were satisfying our minds, but were not bringing up us the delights we could expect from them. So the point I want to make here, and this is why I'm returning to the models or to the question of enjoyment, is how much museums and exhibitions and also architecture is bringing back the delight. And here I will exit for a minute the realm of museums and of exhibitions. It is clear that the inability of most architects today of dealing with the question of delight in terms of viewing, experiencing, living in shaped in design space is a real problem in the relationship of architecture with the audience. The image architecture is projecting of itself is the image of sophisticated, sometimes elegant, sometimes acrobatic practice that is not, cannot be related to hedonism, cannot be related to pleasure, to enjoyment. So I think that if only exhibitions would start or reconnect with this question, we could perhaps expect better from architecture. So I will conclude by making two more little points. Here we see an exhibition that had an architectural exhibition that had incredible success 15 years ago. This exhibition was called Cité Ciné and was about showing pieces of cities as they had been shaped by the movies, as movie sets. Of course, these were movie sets. This was not real architecture, but architecture as filtered already through the eyes and the pencil of the stage of the movie designer. But what was important here was the double mediation. The audience was able at understanding architectural issues because they were presented through the lens of a practice they understood and valued. And I will just use one example to strengthen my point. Two views of Buenos Aires. Just imagine that the NAI next door organizes an exhibition about the eclectic architecture of Buenos Aires. The audience would be next to zero in this city, highly modernist-oriented city. If you start saying that you will show that it will be about architecture and tango, maybe it will become better. If you more modestly say Borges the Argentinian writer, the Porteño writer, in his architecture, in his framework, then you will perhaps draw, or the same could be true with Prague. If instead of making a show on Czech cubism, you make a show on Kafka's Prague, showing exactly the same objects, your audience will be greater by 2 or 3 magnitudes. So we have to learn that mediation needs additional mediation. Mediation never ends. In order to be successful, in order to be interesting and efficient, needs to deal with what is the level of expectation. This is where, of course, ideas such as or concepts such as the concept of perception used in literary theory are so helpful. So I think that if we want to use as members of the architectural community, architects, teachers, scholars, critics, if we want to design and live in a world where architecture will be a better understood discipline, we have to go beyond the culture of a monument and the culture of celebrity. Here, of course, a very magnificent project, a project I like very much by Jean Nouvel, the Akbar Tower in Barcelona. We have really to deal with the many layerings of culture in which architecture is taken. And Nouvel, who is an avid moviegoer, is very, I think, realistic about this. So I just want to end, to bring the story I had initiated to its end. Alejandro had mentioned the museum I had developed for 5 years and said it was still in development. It is still. The idea of the museum was to put together the plaster casts I had shown before, but presenting them clearly as a construct of the 19th century, not as the real Middle Age, but the way, as the manner in which the age of Romanticism imagined medieval architecture. And then I came up with the idea of a gallery dealing with contemporary architecture, with several ideas. On the top, one of the concepts in a small design competition we made was by Liz Diller and Rick Scofidio, who designed a very interesting gallery with 2 sides. One side was presenting architecture as analog objects, plans, drawings, etc. The other side was presenting architecture as digital objects. And I had the suspicion the project was maybe 4 times over budget. But also the project was very, I think, much too opportunistically focused on the question of representation. That is, on mediation, inside mediation, and was difficult to implement. So we decided not to take it. Another project was by François Seigneur, a former partner of Nouvel, who had the great idea of introducing total darkness in the only architectural museum in the world facing the Eiffel Tower. So this project couldn't fly very far. And in the end, the drawing is not very relevant, but please don't look at the graphic codes. The decisions we made, and of course you see here the Eiffel Tower, was to work with a group of Catalan architects who essentially Fernando Marsa, who has designed the little Gaudi Museum in Barcelona, and in a way to introduce new media, but in contrast and in permanent dialogue with these compelling media that are still drawings, models, actual full-size pieces of buildings, and with the idea that the totem of modernity, the only heroic program that could be compared with the cathedrals featured in plaster, 12 meters high on the floor below, was to discuss the skyscraper. So this project has been, to a large extent, dismantled. The leadership has been taken up by an alliance of ignorance and accountants. But enough is left to, I think, to make some pungent points about the meaning of architectural culture in our times. What might be lost, however, and this is really the last word, is a point I was very interested in making in this museum, a point which brings us to the very nature of mediation in exhibitions, in museums, and in public functions, is that there cannot be a single, there cannot be a one-directional exchange between the world of architecture and the citizens if we are aiming at creating a meaningful, sustainable, and beautiful idea of the term, a beautiful world. What we need is a sort of, and it was my utopian goal in making this project, and it might be a useful conclusion for this series, perhaps. What we need is a sort of mutual reconstruction of our abilities to dialogue. Architects must learn how to relate to the others and how to relate to their audience and to the citizens. They must reconstruct their ability to dialogue. And at the same time, in order not to be perceived as dismissive professionals, at the same time, citizens also need to be acculturated to architecture. And this is the function of mediation. Citizens must also learn, accept the fact that architects will not be dictators systematically, will not be also in an opposite way, will not be pencil they might use in completely democratic and closely controlled patterns, that architects also have their own specificity and culture. I think that this mutual construction of an ability to dialogue is the best thing we can expect from mediation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Louis, for this. No, you should stay here because now we are going to ask you some questions. I thought it was a very interesting ending to the series and the addressing of certain points that probably nobody else addressed with such a level of precision. My first question will relate to one of the examples that you make during the lecture of that exhibition of Buenos Aires. On one side, you are saying that architectural exhibitions are there to focus, to put into a frame a reality that otherwise becomes invisible to us or to the public at large. Now, as a curator, when you have to choose a show, I imagine it's much more complicated than this, but how much do you give to the audience the lead in terms of because obviously you need to mediate and you want to say something, you want to put something into frame, but you also want to have a certain audience in order to be able to have impact or effect.
No, I think here I'm in a way in the same position of a designing architect, and I must also admit that in a way doing for a frustrated architect like me, I have practiced, I've done some design work, but I'm not, at some point I felt happier in writing books and studying or teaching. I think that making exhibitions is a way of reconciliating my two conflicting halves by putting knowledge into space. I think it is a way of in a way, it is a sort of successful therapy for me. But I think that architects have to, you can't expect architects to be listening to everybody and to be completely at the service of the users. The responsibility of good architects is to interiorize the users' practice, to be able to accommodate it in the building, to be able to interiorize what change will introduce, and to make a convincing statement with a design. So when you're producing a movie, the problem is to tell a successful story and to have a happy audience in the end. And an exhibition is a little like that. An exhibition usually is not a role game in which everybody is invited to participate. I like exhibitions that play with extravagant objects, extraordinary objects that strike you, but at the same time, exhibitions that tell a story. And when you're telling a story, I mean, there is a beginning and an end, and it's a directive pattern. It can't be a democratic pattern. Then democracy might happen when you discuss after the lecture, but and when committees meet. But the exhibition is to some extent a gesture of fiction, in which you pick up characters. I mean, you say, okay, here I will follow the writer and not the architect. And the writer, through the words of the writer, I will discover a city, and then I will point to the buildings and make them understandable and bring forward drawings or objects that otherwise would never have any meaning to this particular audience.
Do you think, I was by chance looking at the Herzog de Meuron show in the Tate last weekend, and at some point you were talking about recovering the pleasure of the objects as a kind of integral part of the experience of, or the intention to communicate the experience of architecture. Also, you have a talk, and I think at some point this was a very generalized trend amongst architects, especially American architects, in which the exhibitions were much more about what you call the œuvre versus the ouvrage. I mean, there seemed to have been in the 80s in architects like Dylan Scofidio or Peter Eisenman a kind of emphasis in presenting the work as some sort of intellectual exercise, and now we see Herzog de Meuron and maybe content, if you want. Although I mean, you cannot where the work is presented almost in an intentionally unstructured way, almost for what I mean. Do you think there is a certain relationship to how the world of architecture is evolving? Do you think it's just we are talking about particular architects in this comparison?
I think that we have to realize we have sometimes to introduce some psychological concepts into the interpretation of architecture. So of course what is called by psychoanalysts the topical structure introduced by Freud has a meaning. So there is something like an architectural superego that represses your desire sometimes to do extravagant things for fun. And some architects are repressed by the superego to the point of becoming almost mute. There is also a very important concept that can be used for architecture. It's the concept of the ideal of the self. So what is the ideal of the self of Herzog and de Meuron, who are numbering their buildings, opus project number 1 to project number X, Y, Z? I think that their model is the model of a conceptual artist. But at the same time, they have a certain... As I haven't seen this particular show, I remember the beautiful show organized by the CCA that went after that in Basel, where they were showing all the objects that were associated with their design, from works of art of their collection to their own drawings to examples of materials. It was a fabulous show where you felt that the sense of guilt of the artist was working. So they had to demonstrate that they were dealing with real stuff. But they were not only about ideas, but they were also working with stuff and handling and manipulating stuff. So I think that this is pretty much what I think that many moves of, and this was not the case in at the time of paper architecture of the 70s and 80s. Then the idea was to say we are not vulgar builders. Now the point is to say we are conceptual artists who are also builders.
choose within the different forms of mediation that we have seen a very particular one, which is the curatorial operation. How do you think it compares with the kind of impact that you can have by writing in the newspapers, which I don't know if I assume that you do sometimes, but you don't do it as a kind of permanent practice, writing for architectural magazines or editing architectural magazines, or being directly engaged with public bodies, which you have also partially done to implement operations. What do you think is the specificity of the architectural show versus these other means of publication?
Yes,
or broadcasting?
I would return to the notion. I've written in the past in many non-architectural magazines or periodicals, and I think it's very important to be there. There is no reason why architects should not be able to express themselves, or people belonging to what I would call the collective architect that we are all creating, teachers, designers, critics, etc. So I think it's important to be there. Everything has a particular function. It's also I think it's fundamental to be able to read about architecture in the daily press. At the same time, being involved in politics is something that my generation or my micro generation has always been receptive to. And when there's a useful job you can do, you have to do it. That's at least my ethos. But I think, having said all this, I still think that what the exhibition or the museum section conveys much more than everything else is emotion. Is tactile emotion, is haptic emotion, is physical emotion, and I think that in the end it can be more efficient than everything else. Don't forget the inability to most people to read maps, plans. I mean, one way of, in a way, conveying the magic of architecture, but also simply its logics, the way it works, is by a very cold way of juxtaposing media, images, of telling a genetical story that everybody is capable of understanding. I think through the exhibition one reaches codes of perception and understanding that are perhaps easier to unfold than in the limited space that you have in a daily newspaper or in a weekly magazine. And here, I don't want to talk about the professional press. I think professional press is very internal to the world of architecture. It has existed for nearly 1.5 centuries and is also in a big crisis because there are other modes of communication. I think the exhibition has this specificity of allowing, in the best examples, allowing you to shape emotions.
Questions from the room?
Could you use these emotions to talk to the politics? I mean, or what would be, because obviously one needs to do both.
Yes.
Somehow. I mean, the question is what one declares as his or her assignment. But educating the mass public or middle class, whatever we declare, these people obviously is super important. But what we are facing in a couple of examples, obviously, vis-a-vis the possible Biennale number 3 in Rotterdam, which probably is not going to happen, you know, or many, many other initiatives, you see.
Maybe you can. I have the experience of taking various types of ministers, and I will tell you a very, very nice story about one of them as a conclusion, relative to the span of attention, of a type of attention. I've taken many politicians through exhibitions, sometimes for 1 hour, explaining them, showing them. So I think it's a way of attracting their attention It's also a way of mobilizing their desire to do architecture. For instance, the experience I had with the mayor of Le Havre with this Perret show was very telling. Initially, the show was started by the previous mayor, who was the last of a series of communists, Le Havre being a working class city and remaining so. This guy was there, a Christian Democrat, aspiring to take the municipality for 20 years, finally got it. And he decided to go on, and I convinced him to go on with the project. So I had to discuss the meaning of an exhibition in respect to the consciousness of his city. And he agreed with me because he was convinced that the people of Le Havre needed to change their relationship to their own urban environment. I think you can perhaps play, the exhibition is a public event, and you can get some attention. Then perhaps you can get more attention by taking people through a show than by giving them a book they will never read or they will give to their specialized assistant. But my political anecdote is about the lack sometimes of attention, or the very specific attention. Was the opening of an exhibition I did in '97 in the Palais de Chaillot. Great show on the 1930s with drawings from Moscow, from the original Brodecker model of Frank Lloyd Wright, and many drawings by Wright, fabulous drawings by Mies van der Rohe, Corbusier, etc. A new discussion also of the relationship of architecture and politics in the 30s, many, many issues. And I took the then mayor of culture through the show, and he spent 40 minutes patiently with me, looking maybe 90% of the time at the beautiful women who were around then, and not at the images, and but very polite. And at the end, he told me, Monsieur le Professeur, you know so many wonderful things, but you know, I've always been very fond of the 1930s. It is a style I literally adore. Would you, by the way, know a comfortable apartment of that period in Paris I could buy or rent? And now, conclusion of the conclusion, now this minister, then Minister of Culture, his name is Philippe Douste-Blazy, is the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was in Brussels last weekend.
And lives in another corner.
Hi. It was a really interesting lecture, and you presented the issue of exposing architecture through exhibitions pretty around the subject. Well, I would like, you talked a bit about architects presenting their work themselves, so I would like to focus a bit more on that. Focus more on exhibitions or exposure of the architect that he himself chooses to organize or orchestrate, in contrast to exhibitions organized by others. And, well, in general, about why should the architect do this, or why does he do it, or whether he has the right to expose himself, or issues like that in general, like fame and architecture, and what do these things say to you? I mean, you just mentioned content, which was an exhibition designed by the office and not by somebody else. And I don't know the case about Herzog and de Meuron, but
of course, it's tempting to be your own critic, your own editor, your own graphic designer. Of course, no one does that by himself or herself. An architect today is a firm with departments, with people, with specialized staff, with people who have taken over the years a particular function in the office. So when an architect an architect takes care of an exhibition devoted to his or her work, it's always anyhow a collective enterprise. No, I think that an exhibition like a book is an exercise in criticism. So having the illusion of, in order to create a big show, having the illusion of being able to do all by yourself is in fact a major weakness. And this wonderful show by Herzog et de Meuron was organized by Rémy by Philippe Unruh, who is very close to them, yet at the same time understands much better the implicit aspects of their work that they would not underline. So I think that pretending to be the architect pretending to be the only one to be able to show his work is very often leads to a loss in substance, to a loss in complexity, and therefore I think that the dialogue, the same is true for writings. I mean, the critical function of an editor in making a book is extremely important, is extremely formative, even if we know that editors are under influence for very many reasons, because, and here I will return to the Freudian context, you know the concept, perhaps you're familiar with one of the major concepts of psychoanalysis, which is the concept of transfert, the relationship, the affective relationship that the patient constructs in respect to the analyst in order to be able to speak. But there is the opposite relationship, a counter-transfer also exists, the relationship of the analyst to the patient. So when the counter-transfer is one of the major postures in the critical discourse and is very dangerous. Subscribing and losing the distance in respect to people you are analyzing for reasons that are very human. Sympathy, friendship, love, admiration, but they can be very destructive, because I'm convinced that it is only by extracting yourself from codes that are embedded in the works and by breaking with the narrative architects are developing in their own world that you can really value their work and therefore carry its meaning to a larger audience.
Any more questions?
I liked very much that you said that mediation needs mediation, and that there should be a dialogue between the architects and the public. My question would be, maybe you could tell a bit more about, is introducing fiction or bringing the everyday to get architecture closer to the public, is the bringing other references of the everyday life world of us all only a tool to communicate architecture, or is there also a quality in it, vice versa? So if you cannot win them, so you persuade them. It's a kind of tool, it's a trick. But I think there's more than just a trick.
Yes, it's a strategy, so it can be seen as a trick. But once again, the goal is here is efficiency. And once again, we should not. We're spending in architectural schools. Well, I'm still considering, although I teach in an art historical institution, part of the community. We spend how many years? 5 years to teach ourselves the techniques of communication, of design, the codes, and still, when we see. Talking about this very sophisticated institution, but sometimes we see theses that have not yet grasped the essentials. So we can't expect a general audience to make to have the same attention, even the same level of concentration that is needed to enter a project. That's why very often plain architectural shows are useless, and people focus on the sometimes miserable objects that have a narrative quality or a tactile quality. So I think instead of feeling guilty and thinking that we need to enlarge the images, that we need to put more images in a computer, that we need to We have to try to understand what are the channels of that can be used for, and I will use a very pompous term for, but channels that would lead us to a sort of playful, pleasant, enjoyable science, in the Nietzschean meaning of the term. So the way to joyful science is by using instruments that are not, in a way, punitive, that are related to pleasurable experiences, that create identification, or that create distance and horror. So I think we have to understand that we're dealing, when we are writing, at least that's my perception, writing is also about passion, is also about is about emotion, is about very strong moments, and the same is true with products, social products that architectural exhibitions are.
Okay, there's one more question.
Last
one.
I was curious about the pleasure of the object that was referred in the second question, because I was really pretty amazed at with the fact that you stuck up with the concept of exhibition in the conclusion of your presentation, because I remember Terence Riley's lecture here. He was kind of concluding his lecture with Peter Zumthor, and he was saying that, okay, there is this image medium of architecture, but there's also real architecture. And this was some sort of a confession in the religious sense, because a man in a very strong position in one of the institutions that directs the discourse was also saying, okay, architecture shift to the services, but there's also real architecture. So does this pleasure of the object concept that you addressed in somewhere else has to do with that, or?
I would put, this is a very interesting question. I would put it in a different perspective. I think that we have to deal with the pleasure of the object, and once again, with emotion. At the same time, I think that frustration is also very important. Frustrating the visitor is very important, and here I will introduce an experience I've had for many years, and for many years I was, I wouldn't say I was running a radio show, but I was very frequently producing radio programs on architecture. And the wonderful thing was that you couldn't see anything. Because architecture, as seen through the television, gives you the illusion that you can spare yourself the trip to go and see it, that you've seen it. And I think the fact of not seeing it, of describing it with words, of saying how wonderful, how extraordinary it was, of hearing sounds of steps or of cranes or whatever, it created a sort of productive frustration. And I had a feedback of people saying, you were so convincing that, and I couldn't imagine what you were talking about, so went out and to see the building. And I think that the risk of a perfect exhibition is, of course, to prevent people from going to see the objects because they have the illusion of knowing everything about them. So, once again, emotion, but also frustration.
Thank you very much, Jerry. I told you that what we are trying to do now is to...
Okay, good. I can send it. I can send it to you. I can revise it a little bit and send it.
No, it's not something that we close the meeting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Thank you so much.
I imagine that I have to play my own.
My main instrument is really making books, but at this point, I'm feeling some major books to do, but I'm going to get back to exhibition.